So points changes are coming to Warhammer 40K in January. Many things will be improved, but today let's talk about some of the units that have stuck their head above the parapet a bit too far and might well get hit by an increase in points. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some scary units at the top end of Warhammer 40k, and perhaps 10 of the units that are most likely to receive adjustments from Games Workshop at the next balanced data slate. In January, Games Workshop themselves have confirmed that they're going to be updating 40k to their new season. That'll be a new mission pack and secondaries for a bunch of armies, probably a few more FAQs, and potentially some rules changes on the balanced data slate, but perhaps most importantly of all, it's their chance to redo the points of the entire game if they want to. I'm sure plenty of struggling stuff will get better, but they will almost certainly take down some of the top units in the game a peg or two. Whenever 40k rebalancing is talked about, generally there's a bit of a debate as for whether or not to buff or nerf stuff. I think in general it's good to have a bit of both though. With the amount of times that Games Workshop slips up a bit and releases something a bit too strong, it seems a lot more sensible just to make that thing a bit more in line with everything else, rather than make literally everything else in the game massively better to compensate. Nerfing a few of the top units by increasing their points can help weaker armies compete a bit better. It can mean that some things in various strong codexes are just a little bit less auto-include as well, things that might repress other choices from within their same book, and ideally their aim seems to usually be to make things a bit less excessive, but ideally still in a place where they're good and playable. For the most part, I think they're usually reasonably good at hitting things with appropriate sized nerfs and not just making something go from amazing to terrible. And with 40k in the state that it is at the moment, I feel like a lot of the things on this list don't really need that much of a points bump, maybe just some small adjustments. Ideally, I guess we'd expect it to fall on some of the armies that are winning most games at the moment. Things like Harlequins, Tyranids, and Demons are definitely certainly in the line of fire, and perhaps other potential candidates towards the top end of the meta could be things like Sisters, Votan, Tau, and perhaps Chaos Marines, one model in particular there, I suppose. And though the Imperial Guard haven't really been properly part of the tournament scene yet, due to waiting on FAQs and things, there's certainly a few units within their book that are looking pretty scary compared with other things in the game. With all that in mind, I thought it would be interesting just to talk through perhaps some of the top 10 choices that people would most like to see toned down a bit. And with that in mind, I asked you guys for a bit of help, and you've told me the units that you'd most like to see reined in on a recent YouTube community post. We'll go through this in order, starting with the ones with the least votes and going towards the ones with the most. I would say that on the list, I feel like it's a fairly sensible list. A lot of things that seem to be the strongest bits in the top codexes, and are definitely in the firing line. First up, I thought we'd start with just a few honourable mentions. All of these got several votes, but were just outside the top 10. They are credible targets that Games Workshop might adjust if they're feeling like it. For the Tyranids in particular, the general feedback was that perhaps there wasn't really any single one unit that was massively undercosted for its points now, but quite a lot of them just seem to be very much on the strong side, and when there's so many of them within a codex, the entire thing just gets a little bit on the strong side when you put everything together. There are a couple more Tyranids that will come up on the list, but a couple of other notable mentions were the Tyranid Warriors and the Harpies, both of which are certainly strong choices in their book. Warriors have already kind of had a double nerf, their points were increased since the Codex came out, and then Leviathan rules were toned down with them so they don't get the transhuman physiology. They still seem to be played really quite a lot though, maybe a bit more in Kraken list than Leviathan though. Overall, they're just still a very strong unit all round, decently tough, a core unit that's very big and can receive a lot of buffs, and is fairly strong at range and in melee. I think for warriors maybe a sensible way to change them up a bit might be to increase the cost on their default war gear. The vast majority of people seem to run them with bone swords and devourers as the stock weapons, maybe upgrading a few to venom cannons, and those choices have kind of felt badly balanced against the main set of warrior options ever since the codex came out. I feel like in reality a fair points value would probably be to add an extra couple of points to each of them perhaps. That does run into Games Workshop's issue though, where they always want things to be in multiples of 5, and I feel like that multiples of 5 system might just not give them enough granularity to balance the better war gear bits against the ones less taken. Another datasheet that was mentioned quite a bit were Harpies. Again, not really too hard to see why there. They did go up in points a bit, but I feel that they got away a bit on the light side last time the Tyranids were toned down. A nice fast flyer with some brutal general purpose shooting, a nasty pulse bomb that you can also use to spawn spore mines instead, and some nice adaptive physiology upgrades to give them synapse or extra toughness. I feel that maybe with Tyranids they perhaps could just increase a fair few of their units by a little bit, and then hopefully the strongest stuff will be a bit more balanced with the rest of the codex, and the faction might be a bit more in line with the rest overall. Moving on, and another faction that's certainly just generally strong at the moment are the Sisters. That's certainly partly due to the strength of their secondary objectives, which are definitely easier than most, but their army is pretty tricky to fight against for a lot of opponents, with a bunch of their elite infantry jumping from behind cover and then killing something far more valuable than they are. We'll talk about one more of their units on the list, but Zephyrim and Retributors are maybe some of the other ones that are most notably really quite strong. Zephyrim are the fast jump back ones with the power swords that put out a fairly hefty amount of attacks, very strong with Bloody Rose as well, and very nice with Val's rerolls. Retributors give you massive melter damage supported by Miracle Dice for some 6s, again maybe a good target for Val's rerolls if they make sense, and perhaps some other tricks like healing them from Hospitallers. Honestly though, I really don't feel like these goals are that far from where they need to be. I think if they were to increase in points, then something like 1 or 2 points per model would be absolutely fine. Moving on, and a choice from the scary leagues of Votan was the Einherjar Champion. He's the enormous melee beatdown HQ who often takes to the field wielding that Exactor relic concussion hammer, and is a particularly big threat to anything big and hefty, like say knights in combat for example. The leagues of Votan have plenty of access to really good damage dealing stratagems to support him, like auto wounding on 4s or 4 rerolls to hit with judgment tokens. And that Exactor hammer, whenever you roll a 6 to hit, the damage gets converted into mortal wounds, so even against hordes and things, if you get lucky and roll a 6 or 2, then you're going to be blasting through an entire squad in a couple of fell swings. On top of that, he's really quite tough as well, particularly in combat with the -1 to wounds, and has a few really interesting mobility tricks, either teleporting across the board or jumping into battle with the accelerated keyword. Not necessarily the easiest to get a charge after that, but it can put him in a very threatening position. I think despite the points increases, this guy still represents some pretty insane value for the cost. Lastly, before we get into the top 10, a unit that was mentioned quite a bit, though I don't really think needs a points increase, are the Chaos Terminators. I guess they are the centerpiece units to Chaos Space Marines, who are doing at least fairly well at the moment. A bunch of tournament wins with things like Creations of Bile and Emperor's Children, usually in the format where they become crazily durable with a Master of Possession, the Black Rune of Damnation, and Illusory Supplication, stacking tons of durability buffs on one unit to make them very hard to kill. Despite this, I'd say that Terminators probably just don't really need a points nerf. I think that if Games Workshop really feels that they're a problem for the game, which I'm not 100% sure that's true, then probably doing something with the rules would make a bit more sense on that one, something to stop massive overlapping synergy a little bit. I did feel that allowing the Black Rune for 1 CP on troop squads was a bit of a weird decision in the first place. I think if Games Workshop decide that Chaos Terminators are getting a bit too prevalent, they might do something about the Black Rune rather than just arbitrarily jack up the points cost, which would kind of just arbitrarily punish the people who aren't running the big wombo combo with the Black Rune and all the spells, and for the people who are, it'd probably be business as usual. An extra 10-15 points or so isn't going to change things much. I don't think that Chaos Space Marines as a faction though really need nerfs quite as much as some of the others, though there is one other auto-include take that we'll get to that people do think should be toned down. Let's move on to the list proper then, and voted in 10th place were Sisters Repentia, again fairly low on the list, and like the other two Sisters Elite infantry squads, I feel this might represent the fact that people think that they're maybe just a little bit undercosted, but not excessively considering that they're quite easy to gun down. The Repentia basically have been a powerhouse of the Sisters Codex ever since the 8th edition book was released, and they didn't really get any weaker in 9th. At base I'd say they're not exactly overwhelming, 2 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2, hitting on 4s re-rolling, but then you stack that with Bloody Rose to grant you an extra attack and an extra pip of AP, and the Sacred Rite for exploding 6s to hit, which a lot of Sisters take, plus potentially nasty Bloody Rose stratagems such as the auto wounds on 6s one, which really helps them punch up against big things, or potentially the ones for extra damage on the same. Then a Repentia Superior is usually good in support. She can allow them to advance and charge across the board, and with Miracle Dice plugging in for a 5 or 6, it does mean that they can have a crazy long threat range, and charge something that you'd normally not expect a normal infantry squad on foot to be able to reach. Otherwise, to get close, they could use a Rhino, or maybe Strategic Reserve to jump round the side of the enemy, and then plug in a automatic long charge with Miracle Dice. When they're slain as well, they also give up more Miracle Dice as well, which is no bad thing either. Their main weakness, of course, is that they're really fragile to shooting. They don't really have much of a save and only have their 5+ feel no pain, but it does mean that small arms will shred them pretty quickly. Usually going to be a unit that jumps in, murders something, and then dies, but with the crazy amount of damage that they can get, usually that's going to be something that costs more than they did. Again, probably not too out of line to be honest, though I can see why people feel that they're a little bit overtuned. Maybe going up to 15 points or something wouldn't be the worst. Next up, and voted 9th on the list, was the trusty Leman Russ. It does seem that the Guard Codex is already making enough waves for people to think that they're a bit on the too strong side, and I must admit, just with the raw numbers that the Leman Russes can put out, it does feel that they beat just about most things in the game at the moment in a straight firefight. A typical loadout might be 165 points for a Leman Russ battle tank, maybe equipped with an Executioner plasma cannon, las cannon, and heavy bolters. Though things like that scary Vanquisher cannon for ignoring all the invuls and things, plus the Gatekeeper relic tank commander relic, both of those are pretty fearsome as well. Here are just a few numbers for a single Leman Russ Executioner with heavy bolters and a las cannon, firing at an enemy with born soldiers and no other buffs. It is just fairly destructive no matter what target you face it at. 6 dead guardsmen, 4 dead space marines, around about 3 dead terminators, 11 or 12 wounds to most toughness 7 vehicles, or even something like 4 or 5 wounds to a big toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul and -1 damage. The damage output probably isn't enough just to carry it on its own, but now Russes are really quite fast as well, zooming around 10 inches, and they can go much further than that if they take a tank order, and they're pretty tough as well with 13 wounds and toughness 8 and a 2+ save, with stratagems for a -1 damage and a -1 to hit if you need them. The weakness of the Russ in the previous codexes as well was that you couldn't really afford to be too aggressive with them, as they get tagged in combat and those blast weapons wouldn't be able to fire. But now the turret weapon rule mitigates that a bit. They still don't exactly want to be charged, but if they are and they're locked up, you can still blaze away with the big scary turret gun. Then you can very easily include a couple of tank commanders in with the mix for either extra damage with V-roll 1s, extra movement with a +2 and advance and shoot, or get them objectives secured, which can allow them to actually claim some objectives against the enemy rank and file. I'd say perhaps their biggest issues are trying to deal with things that they can't directly see very easily, things that are going to hide behind terrain and then jump out and hit them first. Perhaps compared with the previous codex as well, they are a little bit less spectacularly durable than they were. Toughness 8 and a 2+ save with a bunch of wounds is still great, but when they had Armour of Contempt, it was so much better. Obviously, these guys haven't really been tested in too many tournaments yet. On paper, though, their raw numbers look spectacularly impressive, particularly as you can absolutely spam these if you want to, fairly happily getting 6 of them for under 1,000 points. If they get to fire to good effect, then they're going to blast away an entire chunk of the enemy army right from turn 1. Moving on, and voted in 8th place, we have the Tyranid Hive Tyrant, still making waves and seems to be almost an auto-include territory for Tyranids, despite going up in points a bit, making their death a fair bit more painful, and having their scary Reaper of Obliterax toned down. Now it'll be 225 points for one of these monsters with the Reaper and Adrenal Glands, but for that premium you certainly get a threat that your opponent can't really ignore, and might struggle to do much about for the first few turns. Perhaps the biggest and scariest thing is that it's got an enormous movement at 17 inches, combined with some thoroughly brutal melee, 5 attack space at strength 10, AP -4 and damage 3, the Reaper giving it 1 mortal wound per wound, and ignoring any feel no pain and damage caps, so it will be extra nasty against either of those. Plus on top of that, it gets a couple of claw attacks well, and a tail reroll, and you can use the Adrenal Gland stratagem as well for an extra D3 attacks on top of that. The mortal wounds are capped at 3 now, as per the change to the Reaper, but it still remains a great relic. With that movement and damage, it's probably enough to justify itself just by that, but it also brings some rerolls to the Tyranids army, its own Synaptic Imperative, 2 psychic powers to the table, and the Tyranids ones are generally good, and as it bounds up the table, it can remain very safe as well, hiding behind some big obscuring terrain, or perhaps some Tyrant Guard. In theory as well, if you play with it quite cleverly, you can jump it out from behind the Tyrant Guard, charge and kill something out of the enemy's army, then use the overrun stratagem to jump back behind the Tyrant Guard, so again it can't be shot and is ready to do it all over again next turn. It's a pretty mighty beast, and there's plenty of other synergies that it can have, like high fleet buffs and getting transhuman from Leviathan for example, the various buffs to damage from Synaptic Imperatives, and you can use the psychic powers on itself as well, which could give it extra movement or extra durability. There's a few fun and powerful warlord traits as well. In terms of weaknesses, probably the biggest one is that if it dies, then you could lose your Synaptic Imperatives for the rest of the game. A Hive Tyrant has to be the Warlord, and he can only include maximum of 1 per detachment. It does mean that you need to play a bit conservatively about it, unless you've invested CP in an extra patrol detachment or something, to allow you to run 2 Hive Tyrants. Very strong, certainly one of the stronger units in one of the stronger books in the game. Moving on, and we're back to the leagues once more. For all of the memes about the land fortress and the railgun obliterating things, it does seem that these Hernkyn Pioneer grav trikes are the things that are truly to fear once they hit the table, even after they've netted a 5 points increase since the first version of the unit. The Hernkyn are 35 points each. You might often see them in units around about the 125 to 30 mark, usually taking the rotary cannon plus the searchlight, and often one or more of the other scanners as well. I feel like when you put all that they can do together, they probably are the most strong Votann unit out of any of them. Perhaps at least partly because they're really quite fast at 12-inch movement, and not quite as constrained with threat ranges as things like the Berserks or the standard Hearthkin. On top of that, they also get a pre-game move, so they can potentially go somewhere very threatening if they need to, and you get turn 1, or hide better if the enemy gets turn 1. And they gave the Barks objective secured as well, which really helps you contest some objectives in the midfield early in the game, and stop your opponent from getting too much of a lead before the Votann can hopefully wipe them out with their Judgment Token damage dealing. Their firepower is by no means bad either. They've basically got a 3-shot auto cannon, plus the rotary cannon for a whole bunch of anti-infantry shots, plus their shotguns as well. Getting multiple units of these to all take aim at a unit that's got maybe 2 or 3 judgment tokens on it is going to hoover them off the table fairly quickly. They just seem like a very good unit for focusing fire and helping take down a big nasty that you've marked up with the tokens. Otherwise, they've got a couple of stratagems, a 1 command point 1 to get them a 24-inch move rather than shooting or doing any damage. That could hurtle them over to an objective and play annoying games with the opponent, I guess. The Searchlight can throw out a judgment token for 1 CP, a very reliable way to get an extra one if you want to try and get 1 up to 3. And the scanners are quite an interesting upgrade for one of the Votann secondary objectives as well. Can give you a slightly higher chance of getting victory points in the midfield. Again, like maybe a few other things on this list, they're not enormously tough for the cost, despite the fact that they have void armor. But to be honest, they really don't need to be, given their good movement. They should usually be able to hide at least on turn 1 with that pre-game move, and then hopefully get the alpha strike on the enemy rather than the other way around. Not really too hard to see why at least a few good lists of Votann are running a whole bunch of these guys. At least having a few of them along is almost mandatory, but you certainly can go very, very heavy on them if you want to. Moving on, and into 6th place, we have our only Tau entry on the list, the Sunshark Bomber. I feel like people have particularly noticed these guys just because of how auto-include they seem to be for the vast majority of Tau armies. They went from being a plane that basically no one took before the Codex, and then it still didn't really take when battlesuits were super strong, to in the Nephilim era where just about every Tau competitive list runs 2 of the things, very powerful and effective for non-core damage dealers. I think there's not really too much complex to say about the Sunshark, to be honest. It's just very good for the points. A couple of missile pods, a couple of seeker missiles, some very destructive ion rifles on the drones that you generally want to keep on the plane, plus a pulse bomb to deliver around about 3 to 5 mortal wounds on most targets that it drops on. The firepower is all very good, and it's also fast to get lines of sight on things that battlesuits might not be able to. It also comes with a handy marker light as well, which should have a very good choice of targets due to a fast flyer that can get line of sight on things. Again, once more, not enormously tough, but it's not really essential given their speed and damage. They can start very far back and outrange the majority of things, and then jump forwards to smash something with a bunch of firepower. Tau do seem to be doing absolutely fine in terms of win percentage and tournament wins at the moment. I feel like a small bump to this, and maybe a points drop to the things that are rarely taken at the moment, wouldn't be the worst idea. Next up, and back to the Imperial Guard for the 5th voted thing on the list, are the Kasrkin. And I must admit, even just from a first read of the Guard Codex, these guys did seem like they were very efficient for the cost. 100 points for a 10-man unit, inclusive of 4 different special weapons if you want them, but just seems to be one of the best units all around for a whole bunch of the stacking powerful synergies within the Codex. I feel like they're more a case of a unit that has okay damage dealing in their own right, but the amount of buffs that you can get on them in the Imperial Guard is kind of monumental. Again, like the Russes, the Guard Codex hasn't really seen full play yet, but I haven't seen too many armies theory crafting competitive lists that don't include at least 2 units of these, and often 3. Perhaps just a little bit oppressive over other choices in the Codex, like the Tempestus Scions, which really seem to lose out hard to the new shiny Cadian boys. For the basic squad, their numbers are kind of okay, though not super outstanding. Most of the squad gets their hotshot lasguns, rapid fire with strength 3 and AP -2. You get 4 special weapons, including the option for plasma melter and hotshot volleys, and the hotshot sniper rifle, which is really quite nice for a punchy free upgrade. It really is the buffs that take them to the next level though. Even just with base orders, you could usually want to use Take Aim. That'll have them hitting on 2s and an extra pip of AP, AP -3 hot shots, and better for plasma or melter. But if you want to go with the mortal wound wombo combo, then you can use first rank, second rank, and maximise your hotshot attacks. Their core infantries who absolutely love any reroll auras that they can get, things like Castellans or company standards, but they totally love Lord Solar's rerolls of full rerolls to hit and wound, particularly with a whole bunch of low strength attacks. Then they've got 4 stratagems that are all very threatening with Kasrkin, 1 CP for an extra AP, You could get the hotshots up to AP4 if you wanted. A 1 command point 1 to have the hotshots do a deluge of mortal wounds provided you split targets a fair bit. 1 command point for Armoured Fist for reroll wound rolls after getting out of a transport, or the Born Soldier's stratagem which allows them to auto wound on 5s, again thoroughly brutal and gets around the hotshot's low strength. There's various ways that you can combine all of that to make a very threatening unit. I have talked about one combo for a deluge of mortal wounds earlier in the day. Finally, and if you can get them in range of that Finial Videmradesh first standard, then that can also allow them to ignore wound rolls and damage caps and hit roll modifiers, so again negate a whole bunch of barriers to damage. On top of that as well, you get to choose an extra doctrine for them, various different shooting buffs, or that mechanized one to have them jumping out of transports after it's moved. One unit could take the Barbicant's Key Relic for teleport tricks and jumping up for a brutal alpha strike. Even just getting out of a transport normally is pretty effective, to be honest, good to get them to the front, and they even have a little bit of potential to bully light infantry in combat after they've made their alpha strike. They've got 20 strength 3 attacks. Again, perhaps the biggest deal out of these guys is that they're just not all that tough, but I feel like they really are a unit that when they're buffed up, they may well often just kill more points than they're worth in a single volley of fire. And almost certainly if you've got things like Lord Solar rerolls and a stratagem or two going into them. They definitely feel like an auto-include army for the guard at the moment, and probably in multiples. I could certainly imagine them getting a points adjustment at some point going forward. Next up, and we're back to the hive mind, it seems that the single unit that people feel are most valuable to the Tyranids right now are the Zoanthropes. These sinister hovering brain bugs are 50 points per model, and at least one unit seems to be near auto-include for Tyranids, given their synaptic imperative that gives your army all over invuls. Even if they were very bad for the cost, then that would probably see you getting a unit of them used in a lot of lists. But they're a pretty efficient unit on the board on top of that. Their psychic damage gives them a +1 to cast and a +1 mortal wounds to smite to a maximum of 3 extra. You get those +1s for each model in the squad, so you're usually getting a +3 to both if you've got the full 3. This makes their smites pretty hard to deny for the enemy, and they can often easily get the super smites, casting on an 11+. Typically with average rolling, just with the 3 of them on their own, you're usually getting around about 5 or 6 mortal wounds out of a squad per turn, and a bit more if you use the Neurothrope buff on them to cast on 3d6 drop the lowest. If you can keep the squad alive and smiting for a couple of turns, they'll probably have done the majority of the work to earn their points back at least, never mind all the army-wide toughness with the Synaptic Imperative. Besides that, they've got a fair few other advantages. Pretty tough with 4 wounds at toughness 5 and a 4+ invul. They can be taken slotless with the Neurothrope so they won't hamper your detachment slots. The speed is kind of fine as well, considering they move 6 inches and you can just freely advance and smite with them. They provide both Shadow in the Warp and Synapse, plus an extra Psychic Denial. Plus, if they have to have a turn where they can't get their smite in range, then you can use one of the Tyranids buffing powers instead for that turn, and maybe give another unit Catalyst or Onslaught or something. Overall, at least one unit is basically auto-include, though it's certainly not unreasonable to take more, and I must admit their character version, the Neurothrope, is a pretty solid leader for the points as well with the efficient casts. I guess perhaps for weaknesses, anything that guards against psychic or mortal wounds will give them a pause. Overall though, I still think that they're very good. Moving on, and voted third on the list, we had Harlequin Troupes in Starweavers. Harlequins do seem to be just a little bit on the unsuppressible side. Since their ridiculously strong rules in Codex Eldari dropped, they've been treated to several waves of nerfs, the latest of which was a toning down to the light's pistols in Starweavers, making them unable to advance and still shoot. Despite this though, it still seems that you just really can't keep the Harlequins down. They still seem to be doing absolutely fine, right at the top of the meta, and the troops in the Starweavers still seem to be the backbone of the army, but maybe a little bit more mixed in with some of the other choices. I feel like they perhaps don't need an awful lot doing to them, seeing as if you just increase them by a small amount, that would still add up to a fair amount of points across the whole Harlequin list, but maybe something like either 1 point on the troops or an extra 5 points on the transports might not be terrible if you did just want to try and bring Harlequins a bit more in line with the other factions. Currently in win rates, they still seem to be around about one of the highest in all of 40k. For the troops in the Starweavers, they just have some pretty crazy speed and threat range, plus compared with their base profiles, they're a lot tougher than you might expect. Things like -1 to hit or Mirage launchers, the luck of the Laughing God to reroll some crucial 4+ invul saves, plus being ridiculously fast and with quite a small profile, so they're easy to hide behind terrain. Perhaps one of the biggest advantages in the troops in Starweavers across the whole army is that they can just be very flexible and really tailor what they do depending on the opponent. Against some lists you can just absolutely rush them and charge them and tie them up if you need to. Against some you can play very cagey, just trade out a couple of units per turn and make sure you try and win on points. And against others you can potentially counter-attack hard, Maybe if the enemy pushes with a big tough unit, you can absolutely swarm it with a whole bunch of fusion pistol and Euro disruptor shots. When the troops are disembarked and out in the open, they can be pretty punchy with their various different unique Harlequin weapons, particularly in Twilight where they get extra attacks, and has some very nice stratagems and things like ignoring invul saves, a bunch of mortal wounds, extra damage, fighting twice, or Segarat's Jest to punish enemies falling back. They're definitely not a unit without weaknesses. They do need to play carefully with terrain, as even with their layers of defense, they're not all that tough to enemy fire. Certainly things like volume fire and mortal wounds will get through them fairly quick, and they need to use their speed and stratagems to allow them an unfair fight whenever they can get it. However, being the central unit that's typically running multiples and perhaps one of the strongest factions in the whole game, I wouldn't be too surprised if they might catch another small points increase. Next up, and in second place, probably not surprising too many people to be on this list, is Abaddon the Despoiler, perhaps just particularly underlining just how undercosted he is by the fact that he appears in the vast majority of competitive Chaos Space Marine lists, even if they're not Black Legion, and even weird lists where it feels like he just doesn't really thematically belong, like taking a whole load of Chaos Knight War Dogs for a walk. I feel like when you get a model who's been taken quite that often, it does show that he's bringing things to the table far above what he probably should be able to do for 300. I wouldn't necessarily say that he needs anything super drastic doing with the points though. Increasing him by a fair bit might well get him out of auto-include territory for every list, and I feel like as such a powerful and dangerous character, he should be pretty scary in-game. Just to run through his strengths quickly, he's got a very solid stat line with strength and toughness 6. Typically in melee, he'll be striking with strength 9 and damage 3, with a huge 8 attacks, potentially 9 with his warlord traits. In combat, he gets a further +1 strength, fights first, rerolls charges, and can give himself rerolls to hit and to wound as well if he is particularly worried about fighting something big. It's also very problematic for a lot of armies to remove from the board as well. He can't take more than 3 wounds per phase of damage, so if you play against an army that over-relies on shooting damage, they might be in trouble. It's always just a bit unreliable to actually try and take that damage off him in any one phase as well. He ignores the first failed save with his Mark of Tzeentch. The Mark of Nurgle means that you might not be wounding him quite as well as you might expect, and then he's also got Armour of Contempt with a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, so he's always going to have a good save against your attacks. On top of that, he can give you some big rerolls for Black Legion, again rerolls to hit and wound, and plenty of just standard ones and a buff to charges. If he wants to, he can deep strike, though it's usually not necessary. Plus he's got a couple of other useful warlord traits, as a Supreme Commander, so you're going to be able to drop him into just about any list without paying command points. If you do take him in a Black Legion detachment as well, it does mean that he can use the stratagem to borrow the Red Corsairs trait for advance and charge, or potentially Creations of Bile for fight and death if you think he's going to die. In a single round of combat, he should be chewing through an enormous amount of enemy. He can certainly take out things like Imperial Knights in a single round of combat if he rolls well. As for downsides, some things do counter him fairly well. Things like the Golax Demon Prince or the Reaper of Obliterax might be able to take a lot more wounds off him than he'd normally be able to take. He's not always the easiest to get to though if he's sheltering behind other units or trying to hide out of line of sight. Obviously he brings tons to the table for what he costs, but there might also be an element of only being so much that one model can achieve, even if he is a particularly good one. With only a 6-inch movement, there might be a few turns that the opponent can ignore and play around him, so it might not be the worst to take a turn or two's damage after that. Still though, I'm certainly unsurprised with Abaddon appearing this high in the voting. He does seem pretty much auto-include if you're just building around chaos lists for strength only. Probably should be increased by a little bit for that reason. Hopefully they can get him right where he's a bit more of a usable option and not just something that almost every list wants to run. Finally, and voted first on the list, and probably so unsurprising to the vast majority of people watching this that I may as well just include it on the video thumbnail and get it over with. Here we have the Flamers of Tzeentch, pretty commonly acknowledged to be perhaps the most undercosted model in the game at time of recording, laughably better than the vast majority of other Chaos Demons datasheets, and they seem to be strong enough to justify entire detachments being spent just to get them in armies like Thousand Suns or Chaos Space Marines that are undivided and not, say, Emperor's Children. They're so strong that basically Games Workshop have also confirmed that they'll go up in cost in their Meta Watch videos, repeatedly talking about Flamers when they were talking about points increases. We have talked about what these guys do a couple of times on the channel before, but just to go through things in brief, each one of these 25-point Flamers spits out d6 plus 3 auto hits on the enemy, a strength 5, AP minus 2 and damage 1. Already that's a great start, and against some targets a pretty reasonable chance of earning back your points in a single burning attack, though of course things can get a lot better. It can easily be increased to strength 6 by nearby Exalted Flamer, You can also get an extra +1 to wound from a psychic power from a herald, meaning that you'd be wounding things like toughness 8 and toughness 9 on a 4+, or toughness 5 things on a 2. Just off their base profile alone, a group of 6 of them will deal 39 auto hits, and even with the strength 5, AP -2 and damage 1 profile, just with the Tzeentch psychic power cast on them, you'd average something like 32 dead guardsmen, 8 dead space marines, or 13 wounds to an Imperial Knight. They've made back their points cost and then some against all targets. Even if they weren't particularly easy to get in range, then that would still be good enough, but they're very easy to use and not easy for the opponent to kill either. They've got a great movement with fly, and their attacks are assault weapons, so you can easily start them on the board and still be confident they'll be in range of something. They've got innate deep strike if you need to, and sometimes they can deep strike very close to the enemy with certain demon rules, potentially getting range on things they might not normally. Toughness wise, they've either got the Tzeentch 3+ unshakable imball save at range, so really you want to try and get them in melee where they only have a 6+ save, but unfortunately to do that you'll have to wade through a 1 command point Overwatch that will do that same amount of damage again, something that's going to give even some of the tougher things in 40k a bit of a pause before charging them. They're core for further rerolls, which you can get off that nearby herald that was maybe giving them the +1 to wound. And against some niche horde targets, they've also got a stratagem that gives them a big 9 shots automatically against anything with 11 or more models in it. You might not necessarily need that extra damage, but it's there if you want it. Not really too hard to see why people are running entire detachments and paying a bunch of CP just to get maximum amounts of them in a list. The demon ally rules are also really quite forgiving. You can take a whole bunch of these along, and they don't break your faction-specific secondaries or whole army special rules like the Thousand Sons Kabbalistic rituals either. They're basically a unit that you just really can't go too far wrong with, and if you play with them intelligently, they certainly seem to be carrying a lot of people to tournament victories. Certainly a unit that Games Workshop's going to hit with a great big fat points increase. I suspect that these guys are going up to at least 35 points per model, and even at that kind of value, I still think that they'd be fairly solid usable units for demons. So anyway, perhaps with a little bit too obvious flamers out of the way, that perhaps sums up the list of 10 of the units that might have the biggest chances of getting nerfs in the January update, at least according to your guys' votes. Let me know what you think of the choices down in the comments below. Do you feel that any of these don't belong on the list, or is there anything else that Games Workshop could tone down a bit that didn't make it on here? We'll hopefully do a video examining the other side of the story at some point, which units most need a helping hand in 40k right now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that, and if you'd like another video to watch, then feel free to check out my one on strongest factions in Warhammer 40k at the moment, going through the top 10 armies by win percentages right now. I'll leave a link to that one down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description as well. Making all the videos like this does take an awful lot of time and effort, so if you are enjoying the content a fair bit, any support on the page is enormously appreciated. It is what allows me to keep on making these quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into a regular prize giveaway with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.